organized more conferences this year than I probably would have done otherwise. So for this one, the theme is stories and their interrelationship with our identity, values, and behavior. And for a lot of people, this is just comes as like second nature. Well, of course, stories have an impact on our identity. Of course, stories have an impact on our behavior, but not everyone believes that. Some people have a very logical view, a very rational view, and it's like, well, stories are not everything, and it's facts that matter, you know. And this kind of is very much the two different paradigms in terms of research. You know, there is the research paradigm that everything is subjective, and then there's the contrasting research paradigm that everything has to be objective for it to be meaningful. Which side of these two paradigms do you lean on? For you, is it common sense that identity and behavior are interlinked, or do you follow more of a logical perspective?
I'm in between, and it's funny because if you looked at my personality profile, you'd find out that I'm sort of right in the middle between the logic and the thinking reflective, and it does very much apply that stories are pertinent. They impact on the way we think. If you think back through the eons of time, the primary way in which we communicated, most especially with females, but generally, the most pertinent way in which we communicated is through stories. Even if you think of the story of creation, that is, you go to different societies and you see the same story that is, should I say, shared in different forms of there being a creator, and how that creator created the world. It starts from where people are, should I typically say, different places have different versions, but it's all the same, and it's a story, and it informs how people think, how people behave, how they interact with others within society. And it extends through into different ways in which we do things, generally within society and within the work environment. One story that stands out that I remember hearing so much of over time is of a lady who got married, and whenever she was cooking meat, she always cut it in half before she put it in the pan to cook it. And I think her husband or someone asked, "Why do you do that?" And she was like, "Well, that's what my mother used to do." And so she went back to her mother, "Why do you do that?" "That's what her grandmother used to do." "Why did she do that?" And that's because actually back in the days, they couldn't find a pan that was big enough. So that's a story linked to experience. There is a connection between the two that had permeated through time. But there is the logic that comes to play as being important. So there's a story, there's the experience, there's the question of it as to the why, the understanding. Even if you think of the creation story, there's the analysis of it that you do through different places and parts, and how does it relate to reality?
Well, it's interesting you talk about the story of creation, because as you know, not everyone believes in the story of creation. Everyone has their own stories about creation, and some of these stories are contradictory. And this is where it can be problematic, because we can think of it as a story, and therefore we can acknowledge the fact that there are many stories. But some people believe that the story is actually fact. The story is concrete evidence of, you know, so for example, we can look at the Bible, we can look at different texts around the world, you know, and And for some people, they are stories, and so they consume these as stories to enrich their lives. But others believe, no, these are facts, and therefore, because it says in the Bible that Noah's Ark occurred, let's say 5, 6, 7,000 years ago. I don't know how long ago it was, but it was like a much shorter period of time than the scientists say. And so there we have this conflict. Well, if we're looking for facts within stories, then there are going to be conflicts, because whereas if we just say, well, this is my story and that's your story, and it's like the two stories can coexist, facts can't always coexist, because one will be considered to be the fake fact.
Yeah.
The true fact. There is a true fact and there is a fake fact. So how do you, what is your opinion about that, in terms of like how much can we look for facts and truth in stories?
I think a key word is how much can we look for, because a story is either based on concrete reality, or someone's experiences, someone's perspective, and different people will have different perspectives. There's a saying that in a room that there are 3 versions of an event. If there are 2 people telling a story, each of the 2 people will have a different version. And then there's the truth, the reality. But even within those 2 people that see things differently, because a lot of it is how we perceive things, how our experiences have formed us in order for us to develop the story that we tell, which I guess informs who we are in terms of our principles and values that we pass on to others. It doesn't mean that it's not true for us, for that person with that experience, or that history, that is truth to them. And I think so there is the deep value of that, but then it's, what do you do with it? Do you just, if you tell me your story, do I just take it as fact? Or do I do my own analysis and review and thinking of it and questioning of things? I refer to myself as a why child, because I've never lost that childhood curiosity. That means that I ask why, how, what, when, to come to my own version. So I guess the long and short of it is, there is a power and there's an importance to stories, because whether we believe they are real or not, they are what inform some people. But it's not always to just take it as fact. It's to question it. It's to, and I would say, to gently question and analyze, and then come to our own version. Otherwise, we have problems in how we interact with people, whether it's in the work environment, education, or wider society.
Well, there is the behaviorism school of thought, which like Skinner, Thorndike, back in the early 20th century, their ideas about Pavlov. I suppose it started with Pavlov's experiments with the dogs and the bell ringing, like the stimulus response association, and when you hear the bell ring, well, when the dogs heard the bell ringing, they started to salivate because the bell was associated with food. And so that kind of led to all these theories about reinforcement and of good behavior and punishment of bad behavior, and that our behavior is determined, but we will do more of what is produces good results for us, and we will normally do less of what hurts us or harms us in some way, or harms or hurts others in some way. So that's a very kind of, it seems to be kind of quite a simplistic way of how our behavior is molded. You talked about the story about the woman cutting the meat in half. It's like she did that because that action came comfortably to her. She didn't even know the reason why. It was like, well, that was the most efficient thing to do, and she'd learned that through memory, like maybe that cultural memory that was passed through the generations. And so the question here is like, how much of our behavior is simply responding to this reward, stimulus, punishment, behaviorist kind of ideology, or how much of it is meaning making that we are more fully in control of? We're not just responding to external stimuli, we're actually changing our story in a novel way, which may not have, we're experimenting, we don't really know what the results are going to be. And then people could argue, well, that experimentation is also a desire to look for things that will be beneficial and to avoid doing things that are harmful to us. What do you think?
I think it depends on who we are and the society, the culture that we live in. And for me, it goes back to I'll call it the concept of the why child. There's the compliant person who is told something, especially by someone in authority, whatever form, a parent, a teacher, government, a leader within an organization, based on what they're told. This is what you need to do in order to pass your exams in education. This is what the textbook says, so just do it. Don't ask questions, just do it. This is what the boss said, so we've got to do it. So they're all of those stories, those messages, and if you do that, you'll be rewarded. If you don't do it, you could get into trouble. They're all of those messages that come at different levels. They're those people that are compliant and just accept those things and go for it. On the other hand, I would say people more like myself, who are the inquisitive why children, who will ask why, who might be more inclined to ask for a second opinion, to find out more, to think, does that make sense to me, and to do a deeper analysis of things. So it really depends.
And I suppose another question is the who question, the question being, who am I? Am I my racial, am I going to behave based on what is there in my racial DNA passed down from generations? Or, what influences my behavior more? Is it my race, or is it the culture that I have adopted, perhaps?
Yeah.
So go ahead, what do you think?
And one of the things that I think that inquisitivity definitely comes to play with that. So so the person that is more inquisitive might question more of the expectations of them. The person that just feels within them that they're different might also find it difficult to align themselves to a cultural belief. So if you think of a traditional religious belief that that doesn't believe in homosexuality, then if within me I actually feel, no, this is who I am, I'm going to rebel against that. I'm going to push back and find my own identity. And people talk about tribes, find my own tribes. So I mean, I think that links to the whole concept of belonging. If people feel a sense of belonging to their culture, to their natural, the culture base that they're what they're born into, then I think they're more likely to feel aligned and to comply. But on the other hand, if they don't, for whatever reason, feel a sense of belonging and they feel they're treated like an outsider, they're more likely to look outside for different things and find a place where they do feel that they belong.
Yeah, because it's a question of like knowing which story we belong in.
Yeah.
In one story, we may simply be treated like an extra in one story, and in another story, we're treated like the protagonist. You know, it's like, and sometimes we adopt those roles ourselves. We make a conscious decision about, am I going to, you know, be a fly on the wall and be an extra in this story, or we can find ourselves in a context. It's like, no, I want to take center stage. You know, I really need to make my voice heard. So because it's important in this context. And so sometimes we choose that, and sometimes those roles are chosen for us. Sometimes people push us into that protagonist role, even if we may not, you know, choose to do so because it's uncomfortable, but people push us into that role because they need us to take on that role.
Yeah.
So different stories, you know, each one of us can be part of numerous stories, can't we,
Yeah.
in time?
And I think that to me aligns to the whole thing I was just thinking about, almost with that. People can almost create a story for us based on who they are and how they see us. And then there's the question as to what do we accept of that? So your expectations, your perspective, your impression says, this is who I am. But actually, no, that's not how I see myself. I'm going to recreate that story, that impression.
Mhm. Yeah. And I suppose that would be a question of values, you know, like maybe like your internal values tell you your identity is X, and the external, you know, the people who are judging you, their values are different. And so based on their own values, they perceive you to be different to who you imagine yourself to be.
Yeah. And what immediately comes to mind with that is people that might come from a culture. I can't remember the nobody's name or the details, but I remember listening to a podcast recently. It was a story with a lady who came from a rural village, and women didn't have women were expected to just grow up, um, get married, have children. That was the story. So you weren't even expected to go to school. But she'd seen someone who'd come to their village who was a teacher, a female, and she felt, that is what I want. I don't, the story, the impression that you have for me is not what I want. This is what I want for myself. And she was able to negotiate with her father about going to school longer than was expected. Somehow she was able to go on to negotiate going further to school. And there were all sorts of things that within her, she just thought, this isn't me. I want something different. And she fought for those things, negotiated those things, and created a different story, such that she eventually went away from the village. And when she came back, she was an influencer. So not only did she change the story for herself, but she was able to recreate the story for other females within her village.
And that's interesting that she went back, because I thought you were going to say this happens very often, is that when people go back, they find that they no longer fit in that story. And
Yeah,
they have outgrown that story, and a lot of villages lose their offspring that way, because they go to study and they never come back.
yeah. And I think I think she saw the positive within. She still felt there was a part, and I think that was some credit to her father, who was not totally closed, whereby she was able to negotiate some things with him. And I would also say an empathy connection to the females that you could say that she'd left behind, that she thought she wanted them to have the same opportunities as her. So she decided to go back to be able to have an impact. And I think the key as well is they were open enough to make a space for her and her story, what she was doing differently.
And and sometimes, like the fact that we have changed our stories, it always has an impact on those whose stories are interlinked with us. And
Yeah.
sometimes it can become so disruptive that the village actually disintegrates. It doesn't strengthen, it disintegrates, because everyone wants to go away and lead a lifestyle which seems to be more prosperous outside. The reason I say this is because I was born in a village back in the Punjab, and all of my family moved out. We didn't go back after we'd studied, and most people from that village who had the means to do so left. And so there is a loss as well, that in reshaping our story, we sometimes leave spaces, we leave gaps, and we kind of unthread the story that existed previously.
Yeah. And as you said, there are two, I mean, I think the different ways. One is to create a completely different story which separates us from that story. But as with this lady, there was a different approach, which was going back to change the story for the future in that environment, which isn't always possible. But she fortunately was in the position, and I think partly because the people that she had left behind were open enough to that change and that influence.
And so the question about choices, and the choice of the story that we want to be a part of, and knowing that there are thousands of different stories, how do we make that choice? Is it based on comfort? Is it based on our values of, like, what is it that we want? Where do we think that we will achieve our potential most easily? Is how do we make these choices? Is it based on an environment that is conducive to our growth, or how do you make that choice, Susan?
Say more generally, and I'll see if I can think specifically of yeah, and I think it relates to me as well. But I think one of the key ways is connection. The story that I can relate to. And one way of explaining that is one of the things I do, one of the many things I do, is I do some work with young people who have been in care, so growing up without the support of family. And with the program, that's bringing, part of what we do is bringing different people to share. And most of them are people that are care experienced themselves, and they do three key things. They share of their experience, they share of their journey, and they share of knowledge. in some ways the most important. I mean, you'd think the knowledge and expertise is the most important thing, but to me the first two are the most important, because sharing of experience creates a connection which gets the attention of the young people in the way that it doesn't with other people who don't have a similar experience, where there's a yeah, it's okay for you to talk. And sharing of the journey is the yes, you can. And then the expertise is on top of that. And so for me, it's that connection that helps that young person that has been in care, that might have received the message or seen the stories of people with similar experience that haven't succeeded, to say, yes, you can. And to recreate, reposition, and create a new story for themselves based on the person that they have met, who has come from the same place as them, separated, left the village, so to speak, and succeeded. So, and I think that applies in different ways. And in some ways, I could say it relates to me as well, because as the white child, the curious person, I'm an explorer. So I like to go to different places to find out on what's going on and pick up new ideas and new thinking. I was curious about Japan, at how it had done so well after World War II. And so I went there, and subsequently over time, I've picked up things that I like about Japan. And I have two foods that I would say I particularly enjoy. One is sushi, and that's become part of who I am. I'm a sushi eater, and I'm a tea drinker. I've got my Japanese teapot, and there are things connected to that. Um, but also, I love New Orleans. It's a place that I just visited, and I love the music, the culture, and I feel connected to that environment. And then when you feel connected in that way, you continue to explore, you find out more, and you pick up on things. And I think as I have gone through life, I've done that in different places. There's someone, myself as someone that is British born, that influences me. I'm of Nigerian origin, that influences me. But I've traveled to different parts of the world that also impact on me and help to form who I am.
Yeah, it's like a story that has been enriched by drawing on other stories that you visited, basically, right?
Yes.
And um, in terms of the mystery of stories and creativity, then, so when we look at New Orleans, we look at Japan, we look at Nigeria, we look at Britain, and it's like each of these places has a long history of stories, and your your travels, your journeys, like from one to the other, there's quite a bit of mystery around how do we make sense of all these different experiences and adapt our identity to embrace all these different experiences. What for you is common sense around that, and what for you is like something that we could further explore?
I think it relates to who I am. I'm someone who has one fundamental belief that surpasses everything else, and that is my belief in the value of people. I believe everyone has value, has something unique, something special to offer. Everyone has a story and an experience that informs them, and for good and for bad. So there's always a why as to why people behave the way they are and do the things they do. And I think understanding people's stories makes life so much easier. It means you can see people that do things that aren't right, that are even categorically wrong. And you can, if you understand their story, their journey, how they got to that place, that thinking, not all the time, but more often than not, you can feel an empathy for them, an understanding of them, that means that even while there's no question about right or wrong, there's an acceptance of them. And there's within, even beyond right and wrong, if you are curious about people's stories, then you'll find that there's something to learn from each and every person that we meet. So you could say that there's a mystery with that. There's something also exciting within that, which enriches us.
That's right, because when we have a conversation with someone, we become a part of their story. Because before this conversation, there were things that you've just told me now that I didn't know. So I've become a part of that story because now I know some things that you have just told me, and vice versa. And so we become interlinked with each other's stories. And so if we have listened to what the other person said, only if we've listened, I think
that's key.
Yeah, because otherwise, if we haven't, if we've just been in the same place, then perhaps that story hasn't really touched us.
Yeah,
or it's left no mark, it's left no impression on us.
exactly.
So, okay, is there anything else that you would like to say about stories, creativity, and values, identity, and the things that we've been discussing?
I just highlight the importance of it, and I can say that in the context. I mean, as you know, I do a fair bit of writing. I've just written my third book, which is Male Perspectives on the Value of Women at Work. And I mention that because it's based on conversations that I've had with a number of men. And the key is I've learned so much. I learned so much from the conversations, not just about women in the workplace and how women see, how men see women, but also how men think, how they do things in the work environment, and how they, should I say, navigate. And the interesting thing for me with this, linking back to stories, these are men telling stories openly that they don't normally tell. And there's some of the things that they've written that some of the women that have read the book are quite, they get a bit frustrated. They think these things could be very annoying. But because it's in the context of stories and they understand where the men are coming from, all the things we've been speaking about, it makes it easier to accept. Mm-hmm. And I think the world that we live in today, what I've just done, that project illustrates the importance of taking the time to talk to people, to understand their stories, to learn of them, and to learn of ourselves in the process.
Yes, that's right. And when we sometimes when we hear other people's stories about us, it can almost be humorous, because we can see that it's not reality, it's not fact. But if we make judgments about other people, that's almost as though our judgments, we are putting them forward as though they are true, they are facts about the person. Whereas if we say, well, this is my impression, my story about your behavior, then that becomes more acceptable because we're not claiming it to be the truth.
Yeah, and then there is room for a discussion, where you can say, this is the story as I see it, this is the impression that I have, and I can feed back to you, actually, it's not quite like that because of A, B, and C.
Mhm.
And that ultimately, that interaction with the questioners, with the right intentions behind the questions, and accepting in good faith, enables us to move forward more positively.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Susan. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I'll hope to speak with you again soon.
Thank you, Jessica. It was very nice. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.